All right, here we go. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our next panel. Our next panel is actually going to be touching one of the main themes of our conference, which is really to speak about the cloud in its every form. And you know, one of the questions and the collaboration discussions we had with the panelists is, can we even define cloud anymore? Just because it's off-premise, can we just call it a cloud? So, and a lot of people and a lot of vendors kind of get out there and say, well, we've been doing this as a cloud business because we've been providing the service. So for the sake of the argument, we're just going to call collective cloud discussion that we're going to be covering for the afternoon session. But we're very, very pleased to have a very diverse and a very impressive set of speakers from one of the most innovative companies out there. And I'm sure for those of you who joined us last year compared to this year, one of our main focus was to really get the innovative companies to come and speak about how they are going to be addressing the challenges moving forward. Quite frankly, I just finished reading a report by PwC, and they are also confirming that it is up to innovative and nimble and smaller companies to figure out some of these challenges with compared to bigger technology companies that may potentially be stifled because of their bigger structure that they're dealing with. So with that, we have Tom Gillis, who is the CEO of Bracket Computing. Tom joins us to really speak about how do you trust the cloud from a compliance standpoint, and really has some very insightful thoughts around approaches in dealing with that. After Tom, we actually have Andrew Wertkin, the CTO of BlueCat Networks, who's also going to be touching on the infrastructure and the network and how do we address the challenges from the cloud within that perspective. And then Jason Reeves from Skyhigh Networks, who's going to be talking to us about various apps, the cloud services, public services, and of course, Stephen Boyer, the co-founder and CTO of BitSight, who's also going to be talking about all of us who are either a cloud provider or service provider and how we are being ranked and behaving, and when it comes to our scores as a vendor and where that data comes from and how we can work collaboratively together to really improve the data and improve the services for our customers. So let's give a warm welcome to our panelists. We're going to start with Tom as the keynote talk for the panel, and then pass it on to all of our panelists, and then come back with a directed question and answers, and of course taking questions from the audience as well. Tom?
Thank you, Ramesh, and thank everyone for having me here. So I'm Tom Gillis, I'm the CEO of Bracket Computing. Bracket is 4 years old, and as Ramesh said, we are focused on building infrastructure that lets large enterprise, security-conscious enterprise companies take advantage of servers, storage, and computing data center capacity that they don't necessarily physically control. And so I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation this morning, and I always sit and listen to all these different ideas, and I think, like, what's the takeaway, right? And so for me, one of the takeaways from what I heard this morning was that as we move into this realm of like a very digital world, there's fundamentally new policy decisions that have to be made about, sort of self-driving car crashing into a bus and who's going to survive. And those policies won't be resolved until me and my peers retire or die. And so that's a long time, I hope, anyway. And so for the next 10 or 20 years, I think we have to live in a world where cyber is a fact of life, and companies need to take responsibility for their own cyber defenses. And so to give you a little bit of perspective on where I'm coming from, Bracket's actually my third company, third startup. Second one was a company called IronPort, which was an email security appliance, was acquired by Cisco back in 2007. And after the acquisition, I ran Cisco's security business for about 5 years. So firewalls, VPNs, IPSs. So I spent a lot of time talking to security customers, right? Mostly in the data center. And so it's interesting to me to look at how security is evolving. So much of what we talk about on the ground when we're actually like setting up security infrastructure, it all ties back to physical constructs, right? A firewall was this thing that came in a box, and a server was also, or an application was also something that came in a box, right? So your web server was in one box, your app server was in a different box, and the database was on a bigger box still, and you could connect these things by cables, and the cables would plug into one port of a firewall and the other port of a firewall, and this is what IP segmentation is about, right? So has anyone managed a firewall here? Like, kind of like show of hands? Okay, so a bunch of people. Oh, a lot of people, right? So when I was at Cisco, one of the feature requests that I got from our big financial services customers was they wanted to move from 500,000 firewall rules to 750,000 firewall rules. Like, anybody read these firewall rules? Like, it's just this incredibly complex gobbledygook. And what would happen is people would put rules into the firewall, and then no one would ever touch them. Like, and the guy that put the rule in the firewall is gone, and no one really knows. And so this thing just should grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So that's not a very effective solution. And so as we started looking at cloud and virtualization, there's a huge amount of effort to map these existing constructs like IP segmentation and VLANs onto this increasingly fluid dynamic infrastructure. And it's just fundamentally like the wrong model. And so what we started thinking about was, how can we build a system that would allow an enterprise customer to put the controls they need underneath a workload? So think about your security controls, your access control policies, your data management, data residency, your basic policies, and really separate them from infrastructure. And the answer is we do it through virtualization. So I have a couple little pictures here. So if you think about how, like I said, coming back to that physical construct, security tools were so tightly coupled to the physical boxes, the processors and the silicon that they ran, that they were always built around devices. But if we can actually think about infrastructure as defined in software and separate it from capacity, you create a really interesting model where now capacity can be commoditized. And so you can choose whatever capacity is the best for your particular need or application, whether that be your own private cloud infrastructure or Amazon's servers or Google servers or maybe some combination of both, because the answer often varies depending on price and circumstances and what have you. And so we imagined this world. The basis of this software infrastructure layer needs to be a hypervisor. And if you look at how hypervisors have evolved, what a hypervisor used to do was, when computers were expensive, a hypervisor would take one CPU and you could split it, right? You could put 3 or 4 applications on one CPU. And that was a very interesting thing. So we typically refer to a type 1 or type 2 hypervisor. The hypervisors that are deployed in Amazon or VMware ESX hypervisor is designed for that purpose. What we see happening in the industry now is we're using nested virtualization, or a form of hypervisor that sits on top of that server, that virtualized server, and it's used for control elements. And so the big and more obvious examples of this are things like containers. They're familiar with Docker. Docker is a form of nested virtualization where you're putting a light virtualization layer around an application and providing mobility for that application. What we were thinking about is there's got to be the same way to create a container for the rest of the stuff that goes in my data center. The firewalls, the access control systems, the data management, the encryption systems, the authentication systems. And so that's what we've done. Now, the trick is to be able to make that performant, because it turns out that you can actually run a hypervisor on a hypervisor, like right out of the box. But the problem is you're doing a context switch on top of a context switch. So the performance penalty of running nested virtualization is very high, on the order of like 50% or more. But if you're focusing on this problem and optimizing for it, you can create a very high performance hypervisor, and this is what we've done, where we see single digit percentages, like 2-3% tax on the processor, because you don't need to actually virtualize the CPU. All you need to virtualize is the I/O. And so the net result is that we can create a system where you can encapsulate the entire data center. And so imagine you could draw like a force field or a magic bubble around the apps, the data, and all the stuff that controls the apps and data, right? So your firewall, your security infrastructure, all that stuff can be wrapped up in this giant container and then floated across Amazon, Google, Microsoft, or your own cloud. And the stuff inside the bubble has no idea that it's even moved, right? And so this is what we've actually done. And we've done this for some very large customers. Our customers are mainly Wall Street, but they are kind of leading customers. So Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, folks like that. And we started in the public cloud because that's where encryption was the most interesting and important. And what we're realizing now, kind of hand in hand with these customers, is that encryption, if it's ubiquitous, always on, always deployed all the time, encryption becomes a really interesting point of policy enforcement. And so we're just now taking steps where we can attach a policy to encryption. And so this data is encrypted, and the most obvious example is residency requirements. So we attach that policy to the encryption scheme, and when you go to fetch the keys to do the decryption, we will only decrypt that data if the policy conditions are met, right? Which will say, this is US data. We will check, is this in the US before we decrypt the data? And then we can decrypt the data. That's all completely transparent to the application, but it's a very, very robust form of doing policy enforcement, because now we can do things like access control. Like most of the access control rules that people want to deploy, like that customer that had 500,000 firewall rules, it's actually, if you look at the English language version of it, it's like 10 lines. Like the trading group can talk to this data, and the investment banking group can talk to that data, but they can't talk to each other's data. 3 lines, but it could be thousands and thousands of firewall rules. And we think that can just fade away, and we can attach those kinds of simple policies directly to the data itself. And so wherever the data moves, the policy is enforced. So going forward, I think one of the most interesting areas in cyber is the use of encryption, because encryption, this might sound esoteric, but encryption is the new network boundary. Right? The whole notion of a perimeter was, again, one of these physical constructs of like, oh, my network ends here at this box, right? On the inside is good and the outside is bad, and don't mix those two up. Well, that doesn't work anymore, right? But encryption becomes the new perimeter of the network, or an audit floor, beneath which you don't care. And so in that world, encryption is also the demarc between what is public and what is private. And so as we think about kind of evolution of policy and sort of this growing cyber world, more and more we're going to come back to the use of ubiquitous, always on, fully transparent encryption as the demarc between what is shared and visible and what is not, and what is controlled and what is not controlled. And so I think we're just starting to explore that, but I think folks in this room, as you're thinking about what you want to study and where you want to go coming out of school, that's a very, very rich and interesting area for an exploration. Thanks. Do we want to do questions at the end, or what's the format?
Questions at the end.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Tom.
I wanted to talk about my perspective on cloud and a little bit about what BlueCat's doing as well. And my perspective on cloud really comes from what we see our customers doing and how our customers are innovating. When I talk to our customers a lot, and we sell to enterprises across many, many different industries, but we're very focused on enterprises. We're not focused on service providers per se. And we see our customers, I don't care what vertical they're in, if it's a university, if it's certainly in software and technology, but in footwear and apparel, it doesn't matter what industry they're in. They're working tremendously hard to drive connections to their end customers. And you see a tremendous amount of unbelievably innovative strategies. Like the Nikes of the world, who literally had no idea who was buying their shoes, developing this entire fitness capability simply so, and one strong reason why, so they know who's buying their shoes, they know how they're using them, they have access to that data, and they can design and manufacture more trail running shoes because more of their customers are trail running because they're giving them that data. And of course, from a market hype perspective, as we talk about things like the Internet of Things, that comes up all the time, but it's been happening forever. And when you look at cloud, from my perspective, when you look at what businesses are doing as they drive and innovate to touch their customers, everybody wants to know who's using their product, get to that data and drive strategy based on that data. You see the line of businesses at corporations lining up, and a need for them to line up with IT like they never have before. The cloud represents a capability for businesses to drive unbelievably expansive infrastructure to innovate and meet those needs, to drive applications and services and disruptive technology to touch their customers, to get the data they need, to drive the strategies that are required. A lot of companies struggle with how to align IT and IT policies with what the line of business wants to do. You get this old IT, new IT, slow IT, fast IT, the line of business, shadow IT, the line of business going to the cloud provider potentially to get around what was IT. So when we talk to our customers all the time, I talk about this idea of IT is the product. If the CIO and the CISO aren't aligned with the line of businesses and what they're trying to build, then they're not going to be able to adapt the policies appropriate so that they can do things like secure data on the cloud, because there's always that weak link. There's always, the business is going to drive their solutions. They're not going to wait for IT, and it's an area where IT is struggling quite a bit in many corporations today. Those policies fall by the wayside when the business goes around IT, and if IT isn't seen as an enabler for way more distributed technology, for stuff moving from the center to the edge, everything's moving out to the edge, then IT won't be part of that process, and that leads to all sorts of potential concerns. When we talk about this sort of move of compute from the center to the edge, I'm from Canada these days. I'm American, but I've been living in Canada for the last couple of years, so we put the R in front of the E. When we talk about it, we all know the stories, and you hear about the IoT stories and what's happening in the stores and the tremendous amounts of sensors and what's happening in the hospitals. But again, the stuff, it's been happening for a long, long time. Back in 2010, I was meeting with one of my core customers back then, when I was at a different company driving really complex systems engineering type solutions. It was John Deere. And this gentleman who was the head of software and electronics in John Deere said this amazing thing back in 2010, which isn't that long ago, that they don't build tractors anymore. They build high-tech agricultural farming systems. The machines drive themselves, driven by beacons and GPS. They're collecting soil quality, moisture levels, crop density. All that data is being fed back up. They're driving analytics where they mix in other streams like weather, commodity prices, and they drive smart fertilization patterns. They want to drive revenue by selling crop yield, not tractors. In their big industrial farms, they don't actually have to sell those tractors and other implement. They're shared among farms, and they can optimize their usage and their service. And you think about, first of all, there's networks being deployed at these farms. There is all sorts of data going back into the corporation that is, some of it has privacy concerns, certainly there's security concerns. They're updating firmware over the air. It used to be an amazing thing that a tractor has an IP address. Now that's obvious, but there are addressable machines out there driving around, and by and large, people normally would think of them as lower tech. Those sorts of systems, represent this distribution of technology both into the cloud to build back-end services, but also, of course, to create local decisions and drive decision-making, drive compute, drive actionable data out to the edge as far as possible. And it creates an incredible opportunity for any sort of cybersecurity threat. I mean, there's technology in areas that certainly this whole idea of a porous firewall, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the network boundary is unclear, but also there's no physical security there at all. Your stuff is running at a customer site or a store or somewhere where there's less skill in IT, because you can't have IT security folks all over the place. And so I came into this industry at BlueCat. And BlueCat, we do core network services. We do IP address management. We do DNS. We do DHCP. To some extent, it's like paint drying on the wall. The stuff is there, it's ubiquitous, it just works. We get paid traditionally for uptime. Our stuff needs to work, it needs to work all the time. Our customers are doing amazing things with our technology, where there used to be manual changes throughout the day. Now there's tens of thousands of automated changes through network automation as they drive out new applications and drive out new services and make changes via their cloud environment. But we're basically an infrastructure provider, and so we started innovating with our customers, and Zurich being a major partner of ours in this process from a customer perspective, trying to understand, okay, we are ubiquitous. We are throughout the entire organization. We're controlling the provisioning of network information to many, many devices. We are the directory structure and lookup as most things connect to anything else. We are all over the network. They're pushing us out to the edge, as a lot of our customers are doing, trying to get us out into those environments, trying to get us out into the field as well. And that led to all sorts of innovation around, forget appliances. We sell software, and we can drive very small servers out to where those servers are necessary, and not sort of think of like this, like an appliance market. But the real key for us was, how do we take advantage of that data? There's a tremendous amount of data that goes through our system, both for internal traffic and internal traffic going externally. And as we started analyzing that data, and as we started developing the right learning algorithms, it became very clear that we had a powerful set of data that allowed us to drive policy based on the way these machines, these virtual machines, these physical machines, these tractors in the field were behaving. And so I guess my message is, with all of the innovation that's going on in security, a lot of customers and companies are buying many, many solutions, creating this, defense in depth, many, many, many layers, where oftentimes technology that exists and must exist anyway is rich with this data, yet you have it controlled by the infrastructure team who isn't necessarily walking arm in arm with the security team. And the best strategies are those where, just like IT needs to work with the line of business, you also have the different silos in IT starting to work cross-functionally to drive out solutions that leverage what's there already, as well as incrementally add what's necessary. But it has to be cross-functional. When companies like John Deere build those systems, they build massive systems engineering behavioral models to understand how to keep the necessary uptime, the reliability, and the quality in this tremendously complex system. And of course, they're modeling potential threats and security. And this happens not by the CISO office, but by cross-functional teams that are looking at these very complex solutions that are going out and constantly trying to figure out, one, how to protect them as we keep driving them out. We can't do it based on physical, we can't do it based on firewalls. How do we protect these adaptive, running all the time systems that are going to our customers at the same time as we allow as much unbridled innovation as possible by the business, because that's required in order to compete today. And so it's a fascinating time as this amount of innovation is driven, and IT, the security team, the infrastructure team, the servers team, those that are responsible for cloud and virtualization strategies, plus the lines of businesses that are out building the products, are working together cross-functionally to drive these solutions. It's a critical part. It can't just be, here is security policy, don't worry, we have your back, you have to do things this way. It's got to be a deep, deep understanding of why the business is trying to do this, and then layer on value on top. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. Cloud exists, Edge exists, Cisco's fog exists. It's all there. It's how compute is done. It's how innovation is driven these days. And so therefore we need to break down the practices of groups that have existed for many, many years to better align with the business and better align with the cross-functional nature of what's going on. So thank you very much for the time, and enjoyed it.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Reeve. I'm with Skyhigh Networks. I guess first, before I start, I'd like to say it's great to be home. I'm a UConn alumni, computer science and engineering degree. Any other, is there students out there who are currently enrolled or alumni? Great. I won't date myself with what year I graduated, but I did have a class with Ray Allen, if that, any UConn basketball fans out there. I'm going to talk a little bit about trusting the cloud. And as you can see from the picture, you know, can the cloud and security be friends? And it was kind of interesting. I was actually presenting this slide a couple of weeks ago to a CIO, and he stumped me for a second. He basically came back and said, okay, well, which person is the cloud and which person is security in the picture? But I think the short answer is yes. And there's a lot behind saying yes. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But I think, you know, by saying yes, it's mainly because there's innovative technologies that are up and coming that are filling the void by the move to cloud. And there's also maturity that's happening on the flip side, on the other side, which is the enterprises, large corporations, universities, public sector, and so on. And I think once you get to that point, you know, it's a maturity cycle like with anything else, right? When you had PCs that were introduced, you know, can PCs and security be friends? Well, once you had antivirus software that got rolled out to every single PC, made things better. Once you had the network boom and everything was networked together, well, how does the network and security be friends? Well, you had the rise of firewalls, web proxies, now next-gen firewalls, and so on. So it's just a natural evolution that we're going to get to the point where there's enough maturity in the market, understanding from corporations as to what's needed, and the technology is there to fill the void. So just a quick show of hands. I'm going to talk a lot about software as a service. And what I mean by a SaaS service is something like Facebook, Twitter, Box, Office 365, Salesforce, and so on. So just a quick show of hands. How many people in the room think they could name, if pressed, 25 SaaS services? How about 100? And that's things like Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat. Okay. The average enterprise, large corporation these days, their employees are using over 1,000 cloud services. Skyhigh is actually, in our cloud registry, tracking over 16,000 cloud services. So the cloud explosion is here. You know, the genie's out of the bottle, you know, if you will. It's never going to be put back in. And we refer to, when we kind of talk in terms of this problem, we call it the shadow IT problem, right? Because a company like Comcast with tens and hundreds of thousands of employees worldwide, right? Their employees want to use cloud to get their job done, right? So these are all the cloud services that employees can just go up and swipe a credit card, get off and running without IT's knowledge or blessing, which obviously creates, you know, if you have 1,000 plus cloud services running at major corporations, and this is across all verticals. It's across media companies, it's across financial services, across public sector, and so on. Now, the flip side of shadow IT is what we refer to as sanctioned IT. And these are the services that have been blessed and are supported by IT. So if you're familiar with a you know, CRM cloud service called Salesforce, HR cloud service called Workday, which is extremely popular, trouble ticketing by ServiceNow, right? There's business critical cloud services out there that companies are moving their repositories to, their records, systems of record to, which now need to be treated as business critical systems. As Tommy mentioned before, this whole concept of a perimeter has gone away, right? How do you secure all your you know, customer contacts information in Salesforce when you have users coming in from BYOD, bring your own device, right? You have contractors or consultants who need to get access. You don't want to backhaul everybody back to a VPN these days, right, to make them come back, to go through the corporate firewall, right? So it presents a huge problem to be able to secure this data. So there is the ability to establish a trust control point in the cloud. So if you kind of using the cloud to secure the cloud, and that's a bit where Skyhigh comes into play with a new class of products called a CASB, which is a Cloud Access Security Broker, right? And you can almost think of that CASB in the cloud being that control point. So it's going to sit between all the users, whether they're on mobile devices, whether they're BYOD or sanctioned IT devices by the corporate IT department, whether they're corporate users, whether they're consultants, and so on, and really creating a virtual edge around SaaS companies in order to protect corporate data. And there's really 4 pillars that we're looking at doing that for. One is providing deep visibility into all cloud usage for companies. The next is threat detection, compliance, and data security. And Comcast is actually a large customer of Skyhigh, so just to kind of put this, and I'll leave you with this real-world example to show you how Comcast as a thought leader in cloud security has actually put this into play. First, Skyhigh has given them visibility into all the cloud services that they're running, right? So all those shadow services that their employees are using without their knowledge, they have visibility into. They can then make intelligent decisions. Hey, our employees are using 30 plus different file sharing services like Box and Dropbox and Google Drive and OneDrive and a bunch you've never heard of before. Why don't we embrace a corporate standard like Box and then secure that and then push everybody towards that and get rid of everything else? And that's exactly what they were able to do, is use Box as a corporate standard. And now that they have that as a corporate standard, how do you secure Box? Well, the same way that you have credit card threat detection, as an example, where if I swipe my credit card here in Connecticut and then it's used, in Jamaica 5 minutes later, I get an alert from my credit card company. Well, Skyhigh provides that same functionality as a control point for the cloud. That if somebody logs into Box from Connecticut and then they 5 seconds later log in from China with the same account, we trigger an alert to Comcast IT security for a compromised account. So there's lots of examples of how you can protect cloud services along those lines. Next is compliance. Before you had DLP on-premise, now everybody's not going through that perimeter anymore. So how do you make sure there's no sensitive PII getting into Box, right? So we can actually do cloud-based DLP as part of that control point to enforce Comcast policies to make sure that the right data is getting into Box. And then finally, with data security, you can do detailed things like encrypting data at rest with customer managed keys, access control. Run out of battery. Don't worry. Thanks. So that there's certain data that you may want to have encrypted at rest within Box because it's just that sensitive. Again, going through that control point, we can apply the policies for the corporation's policy engine and enforce that. So, thank you very much.
First test to see if you can get your slides up. So I'm Stephen Boyer, co-founder and CTO of a company called BitSight. We are a security ratings company, so we're risk management. We are a security solutions provider, but we are really at the risk management level. We're trying to help companies use data to drive better risk management decisions. And so what I want to talk about is some really trends in this industry. And you've seen a bunch by the discussions that we've talked to all day, but one of the overarching one is really moving from security to risk management. And I think that's a really, really important distinction to be thinking about, is there is no perfectly secure system. You're only looking at varying degrees of risk based on your threat model and your environment and the degree you're sharing data or whatever you're looking at from your threat model. And so where we see a real advance in the science is how do you take data, to drive better risk management decisions. And so one thing that we see right now out there, and it's already been a big topic of discussion, is third-party risk. And I bring up a couple of examples. T-Mobile is a recent one, and Bruce talked about it this morning, and Target. And we think about the world in terms of pre-Target and post-Target breach. And Target's a very sophisticated organization, but they were breached through a third party. And so no matter what kind of controls they put on themselves, they had weaknesses that came in through somebody else, right? And you also saw this with T-Mobile and Experian, which is no matter how much you lock yourself down, if your data is residing on a partner's network where that partner has some sort of access, it's really hard to control and get visibility. So that, and as you talked about, more and more services are being outsourced as organizations realize and they want to benefit from the services that may be outside of the organization, right? They are doing that, but there are risks that need to be managed. The other one is, and we've talked about it, and it was interesting, I hadn't read the PwC report, that about a half of organizations are reporting cybersecurity at the board level. We do see an increase in the interest from board members. There's no doubt about it. They are asking questions. One of the reasons why the Target breach was so important is the CEO of one of the world's most successful companies got fired as a result of a cybersecurity breach. And so you do have directors who are asking questions, and they're trying to understand what they can do, because it is a risk management effort at that level. The next one, though, is, and this is what I really love to see, and there's not a place where I go and I don't talk about cyber insurance, because I'm very, very excited about cyber insurance, because this has been a very successful model for risk transfer in every other discipline that we have. Think about cyber or insurance for your home, for your car, for your businesses. As insurance has moved in, it's been able to transfer some of these risks. Hasn't solved them all, but it's put incentives for better outcomes, and it's now allowed people to manage that residual risk, which is really not economically feasible to tackle. And so what we're seeing is high demand for people to transfer some of this risk. And when I talk about, and we had some examples here about cloud, I think about this in terms of the extended enterprise. This may be cloud services, but this may be the person providing you PR or legal services, right? Those aren't cloud services, but that is your extended enterprise. And we're seeing lots of attacks now come through that extended enterprise. Law firms being a huge one right now we're seeing, where I'm not going to go directly after the bank. I'm going to go after the bank's law firm, because that law firm has their deal docs, has their intellectual property, knows about the sensitivities, but they don't have a SOC, and they don't have nearly the sophistication that the bank does, right? And so what we're trying to understand is, well, how do I transfer that? So that's in the cyber insurance area. There's a lot of demand, and we can talk more about that, but one of the big challenges there for the insurers is, how do I price that risk? How do I know what the difference is between one person who's coming and the other? How do I look at my book of business? As you think about the sophistication of financial services, we have actuarial models, or we have statistics that have told us what behaviors are. So now I can understand what risks I'm taking on and what the potential implications are. And it's been a real struggle in the cybersecurity world to have that kind of data, so you can build these insurance models to take on that risk. And the last one is very interesting around regulation. We had the panel on it. What we're seeing is that regulators are really focusing now on third-party risk. They see third-party risk right up there with some of the other major risks in terms of legal and financial now, all the way down from FFIEC, so Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and it's starting to hit utilities, you're seeing healthcare, where they are now looking at the security of the supply chain, not just your third parties, but also your fourth parties, which is who are the third parties of my third parties, as you start to see that can ripple down. So those are some of the big trends that I wanted to talk about. And then I wanted to share some data and some research, since we're in the academic setting. I want to talk to you a little about some of the research, which is, okay, now how do we advance the science to tackle some of these issues using data and measurement? Right, which is, there's a lot of dogma out there, and so where do we focus? Well, let's use the data to drive our risk management decisions. So we conducted a study where we looked at machine infection rates across about 20,000 companies. Right, and so what we're able to do is look at when machines are infected or compromised with malware, oftentimes they got to connect out. And when they connect out, that's visible in some form, right? That's visible outside the organization. And so what we're able to do is look at thousands of organizations and look at machine infection rates across industries. And we get to see how severe is that, how long does that last, right? And by looking at infection rates and how long those issues dwell, you learn a lot about organizations. You learn about how quickly they respond. I love Bruce's talk about resilience. Well, here, there's no perfectly secure system, but a resilient system will detect and remediate quickly. Well, so here we'll see organizations that have infections going on for not days, not weeks, not months, but years. And we're able to grade that and understand, well, what are the implications? What does that mean when you have these infection rates? So then we took that infection rate data across those thousands of organizations, 6,000, and then we looked at about 200 publicly disclosed breaches. Now, we know this is really the floor because a lot of organizations do not disclose. In a lot of ways, this is bias towards large organizations, which is why we took organizations at about 1,000 and up. But we said, well, how do infection rates tie to publicly disclosed breaches? And how can you have empirical data now to build risk models for outcomes? And what we're able to show here, if you look, when we graded organizations that had infection rates of A or above, we saw that about 1.6% of them had a publicly disclosed breach. But when you started sliding it just slightly down from that to B or lower, you actually saw 3.65%. When you look at that, you think, well, that's not a ton, but that's more than twice as likely. And I put my p-value in there for you statisticians. Basically, that p-value is very, very unlikely that you get to this randomly. Right? So very, very statistical, robust result, which is to say that based on actions that an organization is taking, based on their resilience, you can measure outcomes. And now you can build models, you can price, you can manage those risks, you can prioritize your efforts. Right? And so this is where you start to think, well, wow, where does this look all right for the people that I'm doing business with? How does my law firm stack up? How about my service provider? And now you can drive and have very data-driven decisions. So where we focus is helping executives, risk managers, and underwriters who are not at the security expert level, but who are able to take risk metrics and decide, do I want to write this policy? Do we want to do business with this particular third party? How do we communicate with the board so we can understand how our organization is doing with respect to its peers and its industry? And so you're really trying to take the data and move it into a risk management sector. And what I wanted to talk with you about, we've done a bunch of research on different industry sectors. And when you break that out, we're looking at about 30,000 companies across different industries. We look at infection rates, we look at user behaviors, and we also look at configurations such as vulnerabilities to heart bleed and some of these other vulnerabilities you probably heard about. And when you build a composite rating on that, the industry that performs the best, any guesses which industry would perform the best across thousands of companies? Anyone? Financial services, by far and away. Best performing there, very highly attacked. However, they also invest a lot. They have very sophisticated teams. You've heard about the customer set that are using these types of solutions. They're usually quick to adopt, and they've been very, very good at risk management. Now, nobody is perfect, right? There's not any claim on that. But as a sector, that sector is the best performing. So any guesses on who's the worst sector?
Retail.
I haven't heard it yet. So we're at a university, it's higher ed. And when we did a lot of studies about why in higher ed that is as well, they have a lot of challenges that no enterprise has. They have populations of tens of thousands of users that they don't necessarily control. You have freedom of exploration. They're deliberately open networks, right? And they also have much fewer resources compared to their budget to be able to tackle these issues. And we see breaches at universities about once a month. And those end up being publicly disclosed. And so the reason I bring that up is now we're starting to understand, based on the measurements, you can start to outcomes. And this is really interesting. I just read an article about what's happening in the utility sector. About a year ago, we looked at the healthcare sector and saw that it was performing below the retail sector. And when you had thought back, what's happened in retail for that previous year, it was really a disaster. And so we raised our hand and said, this does not bode well for healthcare. And sure enough, over the last year, we've seen some of the largest healthcare breaches ever. And so now we're tracking these other industries that don't necessarily look great. And so when you start to think about models that we have in financial services, we build portfolio theory, we have the S&P 500 index, which is a proxy measurement for the health of the economy, we're starting to move the science and the maturity of cybersecurity into that realm, to now where we can start to look at metrics for performance, we can start to build risk models about that, we can reason at the executive level, are we spending in line with what we should be doing? If I'm the insurer, what do I need to charge for premium? How do I get proactive in what I measure? So I appreciate your attention and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Questions from the audience?
I'm going to ask my questions.
If you look at threat attack surfaces and covering those attack surfaces and in general distancing yourself from the threat, there's different types of technologies and policies in place. As we move to the cloud, as we are in the cloud, it's happening. Can each of you discuss what type of enabling technology best or is coming out that would further distance ourselves from the threat, from the user? I'll give one example, maybe moving target, but I don't know if that's in the cloud right now. Thank you.
Well, Snowden himself said it. The only thing we can trust is properly implemented encryption. And so in a world where you don't have physical control over the asset, you need to have logical controls. Encryption is going to be foundational. Like it's going to be just built into the infrastructure, always on all the time. We're still early in that journey, but I think that's going to be something that dramatically changes the attack surface and exposure of any asset.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. If you look at, I mean, there's a variety of different technologies in that space. I mean, Microsoft has tried to push their RMS technology for years, and DRM, and encrypting the data, at the source and the destination, and wrapping that is definitely, I think, coming and working towards that. I think that the complexities that you have in this day and age that kind of make that more of a challenge is just culturally, the whole BYOD movement, right? So I want to bring my iPad and use that, and I want to bring my new Apple iPhone that just came out, and I want to use that. And this concept of a corporate sanctioned device, it's still out there, but I think it's trending down in favor of, at Skyhigh, for example, we have Macs, we have PCs, we have, you name it, we probably have it out there. And if that becomes more the norm, it's a challenge in terms of how you implement those technology, and whether it's agents or cloud control points, or you're doing it more at the hypervisor layer or so on.
And I think we need to start looking more and more at behavior of that compute, and measuring what's normal behavior, and start looking for anomalies. I mean, at the end of the day, the controls we put in place, fail because they can't necessarily look for changes that aren't already on some threat list, or can't be quantified in some sort of policy. And so there's a lot of innovation going on right now, just starting to model that behavior, what the expected behavior is, and look for any sort of anomalies from there. So you're at least you're as much as you can or can't trust, you're monitoring nonstop what's actually happening.
And I'll tell you, I think some of the things that we see, most companies are not doing the basics well, right? It's encrypting your data, encrypting it at rest and in transit. And so it's hard to do the basics well at scale, right? So as you start to think about that, but moving to cloud, you have infrastructure there that you still have to do patching, maintenance, and access control, and encryption. And so I think a lot of it is continuing to execute on a lot of the basics, because there are plenty of technology solutions, but oftentimes it's not so much a technology issue, it's the ability to execute what you already have, and doing the right risk management level. And so I think there are lots of technologies, and I think you got a bunch of options here, but oftentimes it's executing really well at the basics, because most companies, and we see it across every sector, even fail to do patching at a regular interval, right? And if you've encrypted, or if the system gets exploited at some point, the data becomes in the clear. And so I think it's really focusing on executing at a high level for doing the basic motherhood and apple pie of risk management.
Thanks.
So one of the questions I want to ask from the panel is, Andrew, you talked about integration of IT and the information security personnel. I think all of you talked about the evolution, that whether we experience in the evolution from an enterprise standpoint or just the new workforce that's joining our companies and is expecting more openness, is expecting to do the BYOX. Bring your own cloud, bring your own device, bring your own session, bring your own identity. How do you resolve that contention between protecting the data, protecting the enterprise, with this push for more openness? And I think, Andrew, if you could start, and I would love to get everyone to comment on that, because I think that's the key to that risk management approach to this. It's happening. It's happening for some of us much faster than others, but I think there's a tension there.
There's a massive tension, and part of that's the desire for openness, whether it's bring your own device or, and the other aspect I talked about it, which is the business pushing forward regardless. We're implementing sensors in this specific area, and they're certainly not on an IT-approved list of what to bring, nor do they have the potential to put an agent on them. They're for a vendor that might not exist in 2 years. Yeah. There's all sorts of risks, but we need to enable it, and so there's not an easy answer to that. It's obviously in different industries based on regulation, there's different allowances for how much that can spread, but you must allow innovation to exist, and so but a big piece of it is just staying ahead of ensuring that the flexibility of infrastructure exists in the organization between private and public cloud, between the ability to innovate out on the edge, such that the toolbox is way bigger, and then constantly monitor what's going on in sensible ways to ensure the system's behaving well. But I think that question is sort of at the heart of what organizations are going to struggle with, at least, I don't know when they'll stop struggling with it. It's going to keep happening.
And from my perspective, I think it's been a mind shift on certain forward-thinking CIOs and CISOs out there at large corporations, that the cloud is here, it's not going away, so we have to embrace it. Equinix is a big hosting facility, it's one of our customers, and that CIO, told us that he used to call himself, not CIO but CINO, right? Because IT security, they're always saying no, they're the bad guys, right? I want to do this, no. I want to do this, no, you can't do that, right? And now he calls himself the chief enabler of the business. And I think it's just this mind shift of that role of technology and security to embrace and work with business units and so on as their first reaction on how we can do this, but let's do it together safely as best we can, as opposed to the old school method of blocking, can't do that, no, no, no.
Yeah, I would buttress Jason's comments. I think what I've seen from other CISOs is they see themselves as revenue generating, which is a very different viewpoint to think about from a risk management standpoint, but they get brought out to customers and shown, hey, this is what we're doing to protect your data, this is what we're doing to protect your infrastructure, and they see that as a competitive differentiator. And so I think that's a really interesting area, as they've shown, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to protect your data, and they really have changed the mindset to not just be blocking, but really revenue generating for the firm. In terms of some of these other devices and what to do with the proliferation, we have seen some interesting containerization strategies, but what we also see is these apps that get installed that steal vast amounts of data, and then they leak, right? And so it is a challenge, which is, how do you put the right controls around the data? I think what it really comes down to is managing at the data level, right? If you can put the right policies and controls around, okay, well, what are we okay with if it gets out, and what are we really concerned about, and how do we control those policies?
I'll tell you a story. So my company got acquired by Cisco. This is like 7 years ago. And Cisco's the IT company, right? And so we were selling appliances at the time, and I wanted to launch a hosted service. So I called IT and said, hey, I want to launch this hosted service. They were like, oh, awesome, Tom, this is fantastic. Like 6 months later, like after you go through these rounds and rounds of forecasts and picking out like how much routers I needed, they were like, good news, you're in line. We're building. You're first in line for the Texas data center. We're building that out in 3 years. So like, what? Like I'm waiting for bulldozers to like tear up some around. And you gotta be kidding me, right? So what we're seeing is the democratization of IT. And so if Amazon Web Services had been available at that time, I would have just gone ahead and used it.
Yeah.
Right? And I know someone would have been mad, but I was like, oh, too bad, like it's up and running and I didn't have an alternative. And so that alternative is very real now. And I think folks that resist that alternative, like more and more just get marginalized. And so, like a lot of my customers are Wall Street where they have this iron-fisted security group that can get away with it, but even they are under pressure where there's kind of common sense where the business owner says, hey, wait a minute, I can turn a server on in 30 seconds, out in the public cloud. Why am I not doing that? And so clearly the right answer is, IT has to evolve, embrace, be part of the solution, not the problem, because it's just too easy to walk around the barriers these days. Right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of companies at the leadership level, they're kind of adopting this cloud-first strategy just to overcome those types of challenges.
Yes.
And I love
that's what it takes.
Yeah.
Just like the big boss has to say, we're going to go to the cloud because a lot of people are threatened by the cloud. If your job is building and deploying data centers, like that's scary, right? But there's always lots of new opportunities, right? Change creates opportunities as well as.
Absolutely, and I think I love the picture, Jason, you had of Obama and Putin sitting there. So can the cloud-first strategy be in contention relation with security? And I think we've heard it from the panel that it doesn't really have to be that way. But what are we dealing with here? The paradigm of I'm the technical IT infrastructure person where I have to kind of reach out and touch my server and know it's in my control versus off of my control, off my premise, or maybe a hybrid model that could work for some in my control, some outside of my control. How do you transform that culture for those really hardcore technologists, engineers, and IT personnel who are saying that's just not acceptable, it's got to come to my data center?
Right, and again, I think it's there's got to be a lot of we have to look at these as cross-functional issues and cross-functional teams. And when you look at the cloud providers, especially toward the leading ones from a developer-friendly perspective, like Amazon, I can architect and deploy an entire application without launching a single virtual machine now. I can pay per millisecond to have Lambda functions run on data pipelines that are going to databases, none of which require me to have a single virtual machine launch. I don't have control at that layer, and from an application builder perspective, I've built a way more reliable application that's going to be way cheaper to run, where I can leverage Amazon services to make sure it's reliable, it's replicated across data centers. The stack that we can manage when we enable at that level is, skills that I'm not even touching infrastructure. So it's definitely, and it's critical, and I talk to our customers all the time about it, and you see it, and you see what they're doing, but it's this, driving together, looking at these things cross-functionally, understanding how to move forward and apply. But yeah, look, it's, our traditional buyer of our infrastructure did this for 20 or 30 years, and they did it the same way, and they wanted that same experience. And we had to stop listening to that traditional buyer to start innovating around. So even as a vendor perspective, it's hard to even explain what you're trying to do if it doesn't start with, how many watts is your power supply. So, it's going to be a time of a lot of education, I think.
I'm going to take the position, and maybe it's controversial, but I see data to show that going to the cloud is actually more secure in many instances. Because those systems are scrutinized by more people who are doing more audits, who are asking more questions, and those cloud vendors, depending on where they are in the tail of your 16,000 fingers of spread, but they're under a tremendous amount of scrutiny, but they learn how to operate at a very high efficiency level, and so they're running their mail servers, they get that thing patched very quickly, right? They're running their web servers, they get that thing patched and cleaned up very quickly, where other organizations, they may not, and then it gets neglected, and that opens up vulnerabilities. And so I think in some ways, moving to cloud services reduces the risk for the organization.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think I talked about what my company does. We sell the enabling for cloud services, and we picked, of course, the hardest and perhaps most ridiculous target, which is Wall Street. And the security guys there said, they went from like hell no to no to okay maybe, but it's got to be all of these things. And we spent like the last 4 years building all of these things, and now we're actually bringing these guys up in production, which is awesome. Someone like kind of realized, wait a minute, look, we now have we forced these little poor vendors to jump through these hoops. We have better controls on the public cloud than we have on our own data center. And then they came and thumped me over the head with like, we want you to port this stuff back on-premise. So I'm just starting that now. So we're moving these controls from the public cloud back to the private cloud to bring it to parity with these controls that we built into the infrastructure for the public cloud. So the idea that the public cloud is inherently less secure, false, like clearly false.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's a natural evolution of maturity, but I think that that's happening so quickly. I mean, cloud has just exploded. I mean, if you look at Microsoft, for example, you know, every time a Microsoft Exchange renewal is up, they're highly incentivizing large corporations to move to Office 365 in the cloud, right? So at all levels, there's this shift to the cloud, and it's happening so rapidly. But, you know, to Tom's point there, you know, he talked about, you know, financial services, but we're doing a lot with the government in public sector. And if you look at the technology curve, you know, in terms of adoption and you know, latest and greatest, they're usually, you know, the slowest adopters. But even within public sector, you know, government agencies, you know, state and local governments and so on, we're seeing huge traction with them wanting to put their data into the cloud and adopt the appropriate security controls around that.
That's great. All right, we're going to take one last question from the audience and then close the panel. Go ahead.
I understand why you all have an interest in. I understand why you all have an interest in trying to push cloud and the security of the cloud. But the fact of the matter is, from a business perspective, you're taking something that is currently under your control and giving it to someone else to control. And so it seems to me that from a business perspective, not from a security perspective, this is a bad idea. Is it not?
It can be a bad idea unless they're better than you at it, right? I mean, I think it's pretty much how you have to think about it, which is where you're going to get the business value and the trade-off,
yeah,
right? And you have to. That's a risk management decision. There's no black or white on that, but you have to be able to understand from our vantage point what is the trade-off that we get, and then you want to make sure that whoever you're giving that data to is going to be better at it than you.
Yeah, and I think you have to parse out what control means, right? So physical control of an asset does not mean you have logical control of an asset. You can put a guy with a gun in front of your data center and surround it with this, you know, sort of moat and sharks, but, you know, read the papers, right? So that model isn't working anymore. So what we need are logical controls that are far more relevant than physical controls.
All right. So with that, we're going to close the panel. Thank you very much, panelists.